Roughly 30 years ago, a psychotherapist named John Welwood, who was intimately involved with the Buddhist community, began to notice something in others as well as in himself, something which he found concerning. To put it into his own words, he said, "I noticed a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks." As he further explored this, he came to refer to it as spiritual bypassing, and went on to say that we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize what I call premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. And then we tend to use absolute truth to disparage or dismiss relative human needs, feelings, psychological problems, relational difficulties, and developmental deficits. Now, spiritual bypassing is something that I've talked about a number of times, although I rarely use that term. But it's something which I have also observed to be all too common. I would say that it first became apparent to me when, after many years of spiritual study and practice, I was confronted with the fact that the quality of my life had not improved in any significant way, and that I was just as miserable as I had always been. And I began to realize that a great deal of my spiritual endeavor was actually a means of avoiding the real work, trying to avoid, in particular, my own unpleasant emotions. And the truth is that I was never really very good at it. But then, as I became more involved in the spiritual community, I would frequently encounter people who seemed to have mastered this. People who put on this pretense of being blissful and loving, of having transcended all negative emotion, who would behave as if they were enlightened, and yet you could sense that it was just a performance. It was as if they were laying it on a bit too thick. And yet, it would often seem that they were quite convinced of it. So that it wasn't merely something done in order to fool others, but it seemed that the main objective was to fool oneself. A sort of spiritual self-delusion. But what I found most troubling was that this kind of behavior tends to be encouraged in many spiritual communities through a kind of toxic positivity, which discourages people from openly expressing emotions like sadness, grief, anger, anxiety, and so on. Sometimes it can be as subtle as dismissing or minimalizing a person's feelings, or trying to rush them to get over it and just be happy. In other cases, if you show yourself to be anything less than enlightened, you can receive a lot of condemnation for that. You can be shamed for it. There's a tendency to divide people up as either conscious or unconscious, asleep or awake, and then to judge those who are asleep. Now, I've said this before, that we're all unconscious to some degree, and that many people who think they're awake are deluding themselves. There are degrees of wakefulness. So it's not that we can simply divide people into conscious and unconscious. But I will say that if you find yourself judging others for being unconscious, that is an indication that you still have some waking up to do. But the real problem is the judgment that we have toward ourselves. That's where it all begins. When we're feeling anything less than blissful, when we're behaving in any way which doesn't measure up to our spiritual ideal, we can be very hard on ourselves. And so the tendency is to repress those aspects which don't align with that ideal. Probably when it really comes down to it, we repress our emotions simply because they're uncomfortable. We don't want to feel them. No one wants to feel uncomfortable. No one wants to suffer. And so it may just be a very natural thing that we tend to avoid anything which causes us discomfort, including our own negative emotions. This is especially the case when those emotions are particularly intense and overwhelming. We may not know what to do with them. We may not know how to process them effectively, and so instead we just bury them. We try instead to find ways to distract ourselves or to avoid situations in which our unpleasant emotions might be triggered, and that way we don't have to deal with it. And for some people, spirituality becomes the means for avoidance. We can get so wrapped up in some kind of practice or study, wrapped up in all sorts of conceptual thinking, wrapped up in performative activities, all in order to distract ourselves from facing our own suffering. Most people turn to spirituality because they suffer, and we're looking for a way to get free of it. And we learn about this state called enlightenment, which appears to be a state in which one is free from suffering, a state in which one is blissful and at peace. So that becomes our goal, to be enlightened. But we can also be quite impatient. We don't want to wait for it. We don't want to work for it. We just want to get free from our suffering as soon as possible. And so what many people will do is try to go around their suffering, to take a detour, to avoid having to deal with the discomfort of it, and to just go directly to that state of peace and bliss. And that's essentially what bypassing means. It means to go around something rather than through it. And the way that we might do this is by trying to focus on the positive while ignoring the negative and hoping that it will just go away all on its own. Or we may repress unpleasant emotions by pushing them down and turning our attention away from them in an attempt to convince ourselves that they're no longer there. And we can sometimes be quite successful at this. I can recall a time in my own life when I would make the claim that I never felt angry. I saw myself as someone who never got angry. And that was mainly due to the fact that I didn't express my anger. I didn't behave in a way that was typical of angry behavior. But anger is not a behavior. It's an emotion. And the fact was that I did feel angry at times. I just didn't want to acknowledge it. But it always had a way of showing up. And I was always having to push it back down, out of sight, out of mind. When I hear the word repression, I think about how whatever it is that we're avoiding in ourselves, it's always trying to resurface. It wants to be acknowledged so that it can be resolved. And so it's always trying to find a way to come back up. And so repression is this repetitive task of pushing it back down, of repressing it. Because it's not something that you just do once and you're done with it. You have to attend to it constantly. But what a lot of people do is they repress these things, and by pushing all of that down, it creates this divide that gives the appearance of having transcended. It appears as if you've risen above it, but in actuality, you haven't risen at all. You've just pushed everything so far down that by contrast, it appears as if you've risen. And this is the essence of spiritual bypassing, creating the illusion of having transcended. But all of those things that we repress, where do they go? They haven't gone anywhere. They haven't been resolved or gotten rid of. They've only been banished to the shadows where they can't be seen, but they're still there. And even from the shadows, they still hold sway over you. They still influence your life in countless ways. The only difference being that you're unaware of it. And at some point, you will have to face it. You can't hide from it forever. It will find a way to make itself known. You'll find yourself in some unpleasant situation, or you'll find yourself being triggered by something, or maybe even having some kind of emotional breakdown. But there will be some point at which you won't be able to ignore it. Repression requires a great deal of energy, and it can be very exhausting. At some point, it's going to be too much to manage. You won't have the energy to contain it, and it will all come spilling out. So the reality is that there really is no spiritual bypassing. That is, you can't bypass any of it. It all has to be acknowledged. It all has to be brought forth and addressed. There's really no way around it. The only way out is through. Spirituality really has a great deal to do with uncovering these things that lie hidden and buried in us. It has a great deal to do with shining the light of awareness into the darkest regions of the psyche, making the unconscious conscious. It has a great deal to do with working through these unsettling emotions, observing them, exploring them, getting to the root of it. If you want to get free from suffering, you have to understand it. And in order to understand it, you have to have the willingness to look at it. You can't turn away from it. You can't pretend it isn't there. You can't just pretend your way to enlightenment. You have to face your own darkness. So there is no spiritual bypassing. There is only waking up or going deeper into illusion. And waking up requires seeing what is there, not making yourself blind to it. Waking up means becoming more aware of oneself, not less aware. Waking up requires seeing all the ways in which you're still asleep. That's how you wake up, by recognizing that you're still asleep. And the more that you become aware of that, the more you awaken. So I think it might be fitting to end this with a poem by John Welwood titled "Forget About Enlightenment." Forget about enlightenment. Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing, the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now. Not who you would like to be, not the saint that you are striving to become, but the being right here before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You are already more and less than whatever you can know. Breathe out, touch in, let go.